thank you so much for joining us this lunchtime for our international speaker series on understanding the climate crisis and action in the Pacific Islands. We're very privileged to be joined by Dr. Hilda Heine and Kathy Jetn il-Kijiner. Ko Charlie Keeling aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team at the Commission, and I'll shortly explain how the session will run today. Before I do that, I'm going to ask Phil Wiles, Principal Analyst in the Land team, to lead us into this session with a karakia.
Thanks, Charlie, and no, Mike, Kathy and Hilda, really excited and looking forward to your talk. Poipoia te Māori, poipoia te Wairua, poipoia te Tapu, poipoia te whenua o Papatūānuku. And so that translates as nurture the life force, nurture the spirit, nurture the sacredness, and nurture the lands of Mother Earth. Back to you, Charlie.
Kia ora, Phil. Thank you very much for that. So before we kick off, and those of you who are familiar with these sessions will be used to this, it would be really great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent into the chat box while I'm speaking, and let us know where you're joining us from in the world. Since we can't see anyone's faces, it's really good to see who will be participating in these sessions. This is the 7th session in our International Speaker Series, and we're really privileged to have Hilda and Kathy join us today, alongside our commissioners, Catherine Lining and Professor James Renwick, who will both be hosting this session for us today. Catherine is one of the leading experts in Aotearoa on climate change mitigation policy with a specialisation in emissions trading. And James is a leading climate scientist with a strong national and international reputation, evidenced by appointments as lead author and coordinating lead author on 3 assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'll shortly hand over to James to introduce our guests before we'll be hearing from them for the next half an hour or so and their discussion with James and Catherine. You'll then have the opportunity to ask questions. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions throughout. We might not have a chance to cover all questions in this session, but we'll try and get to as many as we can. And if you would like to speak to each other or share your thoughts, please feel free to use the chat. It's always a great place to see your conversations and to share any thoughts or resources you've had on what's being said. I just wanted to note we are recording this session as well, so anyone who wasn't able to make it will be able to watch it on our website afterwards. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to James now to get us started. Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora, Charlie, and kia ora Koto. Welcome everybody to this session of the Climate Change Commission's International Speaker Series. And as everybody I imagine knows, we had the release of the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the beginning of the week. And today we're going to hear about the situation of climate change in a part of the tropical Pacific, which a number of people, including one of our speakers, has referred to as being on the front line of climate change. So we're very fortunate to have 2 speakers today from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which is a group of over 1,000 islands in the North Tropical Pacific. And that region is being strongly affected by sea level rise, changes in extreme events, and all of the impacts coming from the changing climate. So our first speaker today is Dr. Hilda Heine, former president of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Now she's a senator in the Parliament in the Marshall Islands, and she's someone who has a very long list of achievements. She's the first woman to lead an independent Pacific Island nation, the first person in the Marshall Islands to gain a doctoral degree. She's got a long and illustrious career in education, and she was the first president of the College of the Marshall Islands. So she's worked with leaders all over the world on how to take action on climate change and how to motivate action on the changing climate, something that she's really passionate about. Hilda is also a strong advocate for gender equality and also advocates for Pacific women being recognised as leaders in mitigating the effects of climate change. So welcome, Hilda. Our second speaker is Kathy Jetn il-Kijiner, who's a performance artist, a poet, a climate activist, and is currently climate envoy for the Republic of the Marshall Islands. She received international acclaim through her poetry performance at the opening of the United Nations Climate Summit in 2014 in New York, and her writing and performances have been featured all over the world over the last few years. Kathy co-founded the youth environmental non-profit organisation Joe Chikung. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but means your home, your place. And it's dedicated to empowering Marshallese youth to seek solutions to climate change and other environmental issues and impacts facing their home island. Kathy's been selected as one of 13 climate warriors by Vogue in 2015 and was the Impact Hero of the Year by the Earth Company in 2016. So I feel we're very fortunate to have both of you speak to us today. And we're going to start off with Hilda. We'll give you on the order of 10 minutes or so to speak. So over to you, Hilda. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that introduction. And I guess I kind of feel like I'm really, really old with all the stuff that you mentioned. But anyway, thank you. Kia ora. Yahweh, that's our greetings in Marshallese. Kile kieneo an armiji New Zealand, an armiji New Zealand. Kamolo li roj gan rainin. Kile paraino di roj im kieneo an majal. Kile awala armiji majal. Ala ba udej wi maron pokona ilo rainin. So in our culture, we start by recognizing the people that are hosting us, and also our chiefs and people of the land in the Marshall Islands as well as in New Zealand. So that's basically my greetings. I want to start by acknowledging the work of the New Zealand Climate Change Commission in the climate change space, and express our appreciation for the invitation for Kathy and I to participate in this international speaker series. It is a particular pleasure to speak to you today about a topic that not only define my government's work, but also define my own priorities and passion going forward, the fight against climate change. And in particular, the need for strong partnership across different levels of economies and sectors, business communities, civil societies, youth, men and women, to ensure we can prevail over this common challenge. I want to congratulate New Zealand on establishing an independent climate change commission. I'm sure the partnership between the New Zealand government and the commission will no doubt result in expert recommendations on actions needed to help put the world in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius. New Zealand and RMI have shared common interests before. I'm not sure if you know, but way back in the 1980s, Greenpeace New Zealand came to the aid of the Marshall Islands, specifically the people of Rongelap Atoll, when it sent the boat Rainbow Warrior to help evacuate the people of Rongelap from their nuclear affected home island to where they continue to reside today on Mejato, Kwajalein Atoll. We remember that compassionate action. It is our hope that New Zealand will once again come to our aid in the fight against climate change. Instead of helping our people to relocate to a safer place, your actions going forward would help us, or could help us, remain in our ancestral lands. We can be grateful that the world's conversation about climate change has shifted in the last years, or the last few years, and very recently, like this week. We have moved beyond the old debates about whether climate change is happening to more constructive discussions about addressing it. Although not fast enough, we're still in an excellent space, even if we spent decades getting here. The IPCC 6th assessment report released last week confirmed what world events are already telling us. We already know. The impacts of climate change are already bad, and they are getting or going to get worse. The report is scary and disturbing, to say the least, but it also conveys a sense of clarity if and where there were doubts. It also conveys a sense of urgency, especially for big emitters, most of the or all of the G20 countries. It also tells us if we act fast, it will pay off. So let's stop dragging those feet and rise to the occasion. Do the right thing by ourselves, by our neighbors, and by our future generations. The window for 1.5 degrees Celsius is very rapidly narrowing, according to the report. It is still there though, and still worth fighting for. We said 1.5 degrees Celsius for a reason. We know it gives us all, particularly vulnerable countries like mine, the best shot at survival. For atoll nations, the risks are extreme, particularly with the report's projections on sea level rise. The reports make it clear that sea level rise is virtually certain to continue to get worse. Further, the report found that the Western Pacific sea level, found that in the Western Pacific, sea level rose faster than anywhere else in the world between 1993 and 2015. So it is indisputable that the effects of climate change are more urgent, more varied, and more unpredictable. Clearly, big emitters are not doing enough to curb emissions. That includes Pacific Rim countries. Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the United States could do more with their NDCs, as well as increase financing necessary to help vulnerable countries. We are not about shaming anyone, but we respectfully implore our friends, including our friends in New Zealand, to come to the table at COP26 ready to ramp up those NDCs to get us to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are all in this together, and we need to work as a team. Before becoming president, as Minister of Education, I was involved in the climate space. My early involvement include working on reforming school curriculum to include climate change issues and concepts in school curriculums. Later on, when we experienced king tide, I was still a Minister of Education at that time. I was involved in securing emergency shelters for victims of flooding in Majuro. You can imagine the chaos and the challenge on the country's small budget when such an event occurs. Later on, as president, my first official act as president in 2016 was to declare a state of emergency during the first month in office, because we experienced one of the serious droughts we have had in many years. That emergency continued for more than a year. From king tides to drought, it became clear that one of the adaptation measures to take place was to build seawalls around our urban centers, and we've done that. But also to build water catchments, catchments that can store up to 25,000 gallons of water for communities in the outer islands. That meant redirecting our small budgets to create these mitigation and adaptation efforts. Following the droughts, we had another state of emergency when dengue fever spread on Majuro and Ibai. We know that dengue fever is connected to the changes in climate as well. We've never had dengue fever in Majuro before. That was our first time. So what I'm sharing are experiences that others from Kiribati, Tuvalu, and other atoll nations in the Pacific and Maldives in the Indian Oceans have had, because we are among the first ones on the front lines of the climate crisis. The RMI overall strategy when it comes to climate change, as far back as the early 2012, 2010, has been to lead from the front. We committed to be out there. Some people might say in your face, so to speak, to be the leader, to take risks, and to beat the drum of the climate change crisis. Kathy and I have followed the footsteps of earlier climate champions or climate change champions and giants like Minister Tony de Broom or Minister Madeleine Zacharias, who led the way for us in the international advocacy space. Minister de Broom was instrumental in the passing of the Paris Agreement. Similarly, former Kiribati President Aotearoa and former Tuvalu Prime Minister Enele Saboanga are other Pacific climate change champions. They have similarly shined the light on the climate crisis and the impacts it has on the environment and people of atoll nations. For all of us, climate change is an existential threat that cannot be ignored or discounted. Unlike other states and countries, people from atoll nations have nowhere to retreat to. The ocean is at our backyard and literally at our front lawns as well. There is no higher place that is safe to retreat to, period. That is the big difference from the situation of other small island developing countries. So it's clear that islands are victims and we are suffering, that's for sure. But we also have lots of knowledge and innovations to share as bright spots for others in the fight against climate change. We are not just sitting on our hands and waiting for others to come to our aid. With little resources, we are doing what we can to keep ourselves safe. As I said earlier, Marshall Island was already a climate leader. It is important for us to show our commitment, even if our efforts in this space are not going to make a huge difference in cutting down emission levels. The responsibility to create awareness about the impacts of climate change on our islands and livelihood is a responsibility we own. We have to be part of the solutions and show other countries that if we can do it, so can they. At COP23, my team and I worked, among other things, to promote gender issues and the important role women have to play in climate action. I was therefore pleased that COP23 adopted the Climate Gender Action Plan. This is an area that needs to be followed through in COP26. How are we doing on minutes? Do I still have time? Or do you want me to stop here?
You can carry on for a few minutes yet, Hilda.
A few more minutes?
Yeah,
okay.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was going to say that on the human right angle, ours is a moral voice because we speak from experience, having experienced the impacts of climate change firsthand. The larger economies have a moral obligation to the weaker, more vulnerable countries who are suffering the brunt of the climate change impacts. The right to live in our ancestral lands, the right to perpetuate a culture and language that is a product of these unique environments, the right to maintain our sovereign territory over our land and ocean space as a country. Even if violence were to disappear, these are of great importance to us. Those are human rights that are being brought as we speak to the Human Rights Council. And that's why the Marshall Islands work very hard to campaign to become a member of the Human Rights Council. RMI has an existing agreement with the United States that allows for migration to live and work in the United States. Nearly 30,000 of our people have resettled in the US. As a country, however, Marshallese and Marshall Islands are not necessarily advocating for relocation or for an option B. We want to stay where we are. One of my agenda as RMI president was to help us gain membership on the Human Rights Council, and we achieved that in 2019. We are grateful for the support of many countries, including New Zealand. And as I mentioned before, our reasons for getting a seat on the HRC was to bring the climate change crisis to the forefront as a human rights issue, and to create a special mandate in HRC to address climate change as a human rights issue. So I will stop there. I think our interest was also in the nuclear legacy that we've inherited. That's another human rights issue that we're still fighting and continue to fight for more than 70 years now. So anyway, I will stop there. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute in this space.
Well, thank you very much, Hilda. That's really inspiring stuff, and yeah, hard to know how to respond to some of it. And I really want to acknowledge your role and the role of the Pacific Island nations in pushing through the Paris Agreement process for that 1.5 degrees to be in there. Like you say, the science is saying that we're getting pretty close to the edge of whether or not we can stop at 1.5 degrees, but you're right, there is definitely still hope. And if we don't make 1.5 degrees, maybe 1.6 degrees, we can still stop at well below 2 degrees. So we can still live up to the Paris Agreement. Yeah. I understand from what you've said that there's a lot of adaptation to existing climate change needed and already happening in the Marshall Islands. And I wondered if you could comment a little on what you see as what's most needed and how best countries can work together with the residents, with the populations of the Pacific, to support them through both adapting to the climate changes we have and helping each other to reduce emissions fast enough to mitigate climate change at a safer level.
Thank you. Clearly, there are individual actions that each of us as individuals can take or can make to help curb emissions. But there are also parts that our countries can take, and we're talking about adaptation here. For the Marshall Islands, we're currently developing an adaptation plan, and Kathy will probably speak more to that. I'm not really sure where we're at with that, but we've decided that we need to develop this adaptation plan, and part of that was to perhaps look at possibility of raising islands so that we can continue to remain in our space. That will take huge amount of resources to make that happen. And this is where the financing of climate change impact is necessary. We all know that the 100 billion commitment that is there in the Paris Agreement hasn't been met. And so we continue to ask countries to ramp up their finance contribution and make sure that we can meet this these huge needs. And for the Marshall Islands, we've recognized this need, this security issue for us when our islands and if our islands will be submerged. And so last month we passed not last month, 2 months ago, we passed the resolution in our parliament recognizing that climate security is an issue for us, and that in our discussion with the United States, climate security need to be front and center as well, because the United States under our compact agreement is responsible for our security, but that has been in the past defined as military security and things like that. But this one is a security, ensuring that our islands remain where we are and we can continue to live here. So there are many ways, I guess. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hilda. I'll pass over to Catherine Lining now, who can make some comments and ask another question.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Catherine Lining, toko ingoa. Hilda, thank you so much for your introductory remarks. I'm feeling very moved by them. I worked as a negotiator for New Zealand and as an NGO activist in the negotiations before that, and I'm very aware of the important leadership role that the Marshall Islands and other small island states have played in carrying the voice of conscience and the reality check to the negotiations, that as people debate what we can change in terms of lifestyle, it's actually an issue of survival, and bringing that awareness to the negotiations. I just want to really acknowledge that leadership. When I was reviewing the NDC that the Marshall Islands has put forward, I saw that you had the Marshall Islands expressly included a provision calling for a gender responsive and human rights-based approach in NDC planning, which I thought was phenomenal to see. And I was interested in hearing more from you about how we make that a reality, and perhaps also some observations on the role of education in helping people understand the linkages between these things and how to envisage the solutions to climate change more broadly. So yeah, any commentary on that I'd really appreciate. Thank you.
Yes, well, on the importance of education, a lot of what we're facing has to do with lifestyles, and so I think having the awareness about our acts in terms of what we eat, what we practice in terms of our energy consumption, transportation. There are so many things on the individual level that can be changed if people are given the right kinds of information. And so this is where education is critical for the in the fight against climate change. And as I mentioned before, we've worked hard to include climate change in our school curriculum. I think we need to do more. And as women leaders and working with our women organization, we've convened conferences of women where the main topic has been climate change, and trying to get our women to understand fully what the impacts are of climate change on their lives and what they can do at home and with families at home. And so we have many projects that women are bringing forth to plant trees where they can. Groups of women are banding together to look at how they can assist in this space. So I think education and involvement of grassroots communities, including women and youth, are essential aspects of any planning and any strategies going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilda. Well, we're going to move on to our other speaker now. So Kathy, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. The Climate Change Commission in New Zealand for inviting us to speak today. So, I like that I'm able to follow Mom after that, because I think she really gives a really good overview of the top of what's happening at the top and the really important initiatives that Mom has led. That was really inspiring, obviously. I know that for me, my own personal work in climate change really began on a very personal level of experiencing climate change when I moved back home from college, and engaging with it through poetry first, and also using that poetry for activism. I think me and Mom was there when I experienced my first king tide, when both of us came outside and saw the flooding that was right outside of our house. And then she had to be the one to coordinate all of the school shelters, from the schools nearby. So that really inspired a lot of writing that I turned into spoken word poetry. And I use that poetry in activist spaces, mainly through my work with 350 Pacific Climate Warriors. I see a lot of friends in the chat group right now who are listening in and fangirling over you, Mom. Either way, it was in those spaces with other Pacific Islander youth that I was able to kind of speak and use poetry to connect to the emotional to the emotional core of climate change, right? Because climate change is so much more than just numbers and nameless faces. It's also, you know, figuring out how to fight and figuring out where you can get the fire to continue to fight even long after you're exhausted. So following in the footsteps of Tony DeBrune and then of course of Mom and the work they do, I kind of began to shift a little bit more into a different space from poetry and activism. I explored a little bit through the poetry, through the organizing side, through the nonprofit Jojibun that I co-founded with some cousins a few years ago, where we started organizing workshops with other youth. And then after that, I've also shifted into my new role as climate change envoy for the Marshall Islands. And I'm not the only envoy. The other envoy is also Tina Stegi, who's based out in New York. And so together we've been kind of thrust into the national level working mechanisms that exist. And so one of the mechanisms that exists is the Taleo Committee. And so I just wanted to break down, I think, a little bit for the audience to see you know, that what climate change work looks like, you know, at a national level, you know, on the ground. And so the first thing is the Taleo Committee, which meets on a quarterly basis, and it's headed by the Chief Secretary and the Minister of Environment. And this is where the different working groups would report on their progress in the different realms of climate change work that's happening, you know, in the different agencies and offices. So we have the Adaptation Working Group, and they're tasked with developing the National Adaptation Plan. And that's headed by Broderick Menke, who's also a former 350 Pacific climate warrior, or current also actually. And he's the National Adaptation Planning Coordinator. And we're leading the development of the NAP. There's also the Mitigation Working Group, and that they help put together our energy roadmap for ensuring that we meet our NDCs. And so those are the three kind of working groups that exist, and they all report to the Taleo Committee. So at the other side of it, you know, we have a lot of international engagement that Mom has already sort of highlighted through the High Ambition Coalition, through the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and through our partnerships with the Alliance of Small Island States. So all of these kind of get fed into one another and through the Pacific Island Forum. In terms of the National Adaptation Plan, where we're at with that is we submitted our ADCOM, our adaptation communication, this past December, and we're the first SIDS nation to do so. And the adaptation communication basically collected all of the existing data that we have. And a lot of the existing data is based on the Raymond Luck framework, a framework that is focused on conservation, creating conservation plans from the different outer islands and from the main urban centers as well. So that a lot of that data and from the Rich Sharif work fed into that adaptation communication. The adaptation communication also identifies where we are with the National Adaptation Plan. So it's sort of just a way of saying this is where we're at, and this is where we're almost where we're getting to. We've so far developed our sectoral statements. So each of the statements that come from the different main sectors, education, health, all of them have developed their sectoral statements that basically outline how adaptation affects their sector specifically, how climate change affects them, and then what are the different ways in which they need support and how adaptation might feed into that support. We've also been developing our consultation framework. So the consultation framework is a framework that we would take to go to the different outer islands that are identified. And we would actually meet with the different climate change, and we would actually meet with the different communities and discuss how climate change is impacting, what kind of observations they've seen, and where we would start to introduce the topics of adaptation and what are our possible adaptation solutions that we could be exploring. And so some of the adaptation solutions we're exploring is pretty extreme. We're looking at really extreme solutions of you know, even building islands, possibly relocation, but we're looking at mainly relocation within islands, consolidating centers, moving from different areas. And so these are all questions that the National Adaptation Plan would be addressing and would be kind of answering for all of us. At least it would pose like options that we can be exploring. But one thing for sure that we've identified is that mass relocation is something we will not consider as a what's the word, like as a requirement. There won't be a requirement to have any sort of mass relocation, but it'll be an option to relocate. So that's the National Adaptation Plan. That's actually a really big deal. I guess I should note that it's a very big deal that we switched from mitigation to adaptation, that we haven't necessarily switched. I should frame that better. We're sort of trying our best at an international level to start pushing for more nations to focus on adaptation and to increase funding and support to small island nations for adaptation. And this is mainly because we've come to recognize what the IPCC has already, you know, just basically recognized, which is that the science is clear, it's going to continue to get worse. And for atoll nations in particular, we have to be protecting ourselves first. So the National Adaptation Plan is really sort of a reflection of our government's goal of looking more internally and protecting ourselves internally, not, you know, just as much as promoting the lessening our mitigation around the world, because that was what our focus was before. We were really beating the drum really hard on mitigation and getting all of our different countries to lower their mitigation. And that's still, of course, really invaluable and really important, and it still continues to be a part of what we want to focus on. But the National Adaptation Plan and the adaptation efforts is something that we're also trying to highlight, as well as starting to look at how we can support loss and damage as well. So that's all within kind of the national sphere. But I was also asked to speak on what we can learn from intergenerational advocacy and activism. And I mean, I think this call is, you know, of seeing how the work that my mother and I have done, you know, is one reflection of kind of the importance of intergenerational conversation, right? Because as Mom has, you know, pointed out to me before, a lot of us who are coming into this climate realm are younger, and we don't necessarily know all of the history that has happened before us and all of the work that has been laid before us. And so that's a really important part of it. But I also, of course, really prioritize working with youth. You know, there's a lot of energy that comes out of youth, and we've seen from the Fridays for Future, as well as, you know, the work with 350 Pacific, how important youth are for the global movement. And so that's why I invest so much of my time in our nonprofit in Aotearoa. We just completed our climate and health arts camp this past summer with high school students. And, you know, a lot of the artwork is really fascinating and powerful, and to see how they use art to understand this issue is really important, you know. And I think that the importance of art in this movement is in communicating all of these complex feelings and all of these complex issues with one another. I think maybe that's part of the issue has been the issue with climate movement. You know, we've talked a lot about how do we communicate the urgency? How do we communicate this? And art is that great communicator. It allows for the grays, you know, because there's so much complexity within it. You know, even with us in developing our National Adaptation Plan, we're combing through a lot of science and a lot of different things that people are telling us about hard adaptation solutions, you know, seawalls hurting our coral reefs, but also looking at, you know, more nature-based solutions and how nature-based solutions can support more of our indigenous forms of living. So anyways, all that to say, these are kind of the different things that are feeding into the type of work that I'm doing. And I hope that gives a bit of an overview of these kinds of different connections between the national level policy level work, the intergenerational youth climate work, and the arts. Thank you. Yeah, I can also add more, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. That was also really absorbing, inspiring. You're doing great things. I have a lot of lot of thoughts about what you've got to say. One thing I wanted to ask you about, partly because it's an interest of mine, you've touched on this, but I'm interested to hear some more from you about how you see artistic expression really aiding action on climate change, or maybe aiding understanding. I know that it is about emotions rather than facts, and I'd be interested to hear you say a little more about how you see the arts playing a role here.
Oh, you're saying how the arts play the role in general?
But in terms of climate action, of talking to people about climate change.
I think there's a lot of really important ways that art can play a role in the climate movement. For one thing, art is a great communicator, like I said earlier. It can inspire questions that need to be asked, and it's very different from media and messaging, where it's very clean cut and this is what you can say because we're not sure about this. Art gives you that gray area, and it gives you the ability to sort of ask those questions that don't necessarily have answers, but it's something that we need to think about. I think also for a lot of us in the climate movement, it's really easy to suffer burnout, especially in the different spaces that we're in, and to lose hope. I think that there's a lot of discussion of hope recently, especially with the release of the IPCC report. How do we maintain hope? And touching base to why we care about it and what we're doing it for, art allows us to do that as well. And I know there's an amazing artist in the watching right now, Latai, from Australia, a Tongan artist that I really admire. And there's all types of really interesting things that she's done and other artists in the Pacific have done to kind of process what it means to be, witnessing the possible loss of islands or the uninhabitability of islands, and it transmutes that grief and makes it accessible for other people to feel and to see and to connect to why they should be fighting. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I'll hand to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for your introduction. There's so many things I want to ask you about, but I'll focus on your adaptation planning, because I was really impressed with how extensive that is. I'd be really interested to get more insights from you on how the Marshall Islands are engaging at the community level about these really challenging conversations about when do you defend, when do you retreat, and they're very, very emotional, painful, costly conversations. And so how do you engage with communities on this so that the decisions are led by communities and not imposed on communities?
Yeah, so that's a really crucial part. And I should have mentioned, Mom went into a lot of discussion about the human rights focus of a lot of our climate work, especially being as we're on the Human Rights Council now, the Marshall Islands. And I should say that the framework that we developed is based and rooted in human rights, in the recognition of human rights too. That's really at the core of our national adaptation plan. So I think there's actually two really interesting things about that kind of make our national adaptation plan stick out. One is the human rights core of it, but then also the fact that it's going to be one of the few national adaptation plans that takes into consideration the nuclear legacy and how the nuclear legacy can inform how we plan for climate change action, right? To answer your question, the consultations that we did, the framework that we're developing, it hasn't been implemented yet. We haven't gone into the implementation phase yet. But what we did was when we were starting to develop the framework, we brought in community experts. So those who have already delivered, who've already done community consultations through other lens and through other work, and they've worked through gender issues, gender-based violence, collecting data on conservation, on terrestrial issues, on disaster, and they inform that kind of experience, their experiences and how they conducted those studies really informed how we developed that framework. And so when we implement it, we're going to be identifying the different groups that we're going to work with, and we're going to actually be working with women, with vulnerable groups, with the men, with the youth, with the fishermen, to make sure that each of their needs are highlighted and their viewpoints are highlighted in silos so that they can feel more open to share their perspectives. That gets collected and that gets fed into the National Adaptation Plan in helping us decide what is the ultimate what is it that our people want to do at the end of the day. But I think it's a really delicate balance because at the end of the day you want to give them the right amount of information and you want to look through the right have the right science to tell them, but you also don't want to go on a fear-mongering campaign and completely lose hope, right? And so that's a very thin line that we have to walk as we move into these consultations and as we move into implementation. And then, of course, there's the question of what would happen to land tenureship. We've looked at land tenureship already, and how are we going to deal with land tenureship should we have to move? So that's a conversation that definitely can't come from the top, and it can't come from a political level. It has to come from our traditional leaders and from conversations with our community.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kathy and Hilda again. So we're now into the general Q&A part of the event. So we have about 15 minutes left, I think, and we have a number of questions that have come through. I'll just take the first one actually and ask both of you to respond to these as we go. But the first question that came in was from Nick McClellan from the Islands Business Magazine, who says, what do Pacific countries want from OECD countries at COP26 in terms of climate finance? Where should Australia and New Zealand increase funding? The Pacific Resilience Fund, the Green Climate Fund, or bilateral programs? So, Kathy, perhaps you want to start on that?
Yeah, I think that for us in the Marshall Islands in particular, we're really pushing for more funding for adaptation actually, because right now we're in the adaptation. I've obviously gone off about adaptation planning and adaptation development, but we haven't even gone into adaptation implementation. So that's like a whole other problem is implementation. And so we definitely need to make sure that we get funding for adaptation and that there's more funding that's allocated to that for now. And then I think that Australia and New Zealand can definitely increase funding because of, the adaptation. I think the Pacific Resilience Fund could definitely be using more funds. Though I'm obviously not against the Green Climate Fund or bilateral programs either. Bilateral programs would be a little bit more effective in terms of accessing funds. But I think this is a question that maybe our climate finance team would be more equipped to answer. By the way, thanks for the question, Nick. Good to hear from you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Kathy. And Hilda, what would you like to add on that question? Oh, and you're still muted.
Yeah. So we've been looking at this because one of our challenges in writing grants is the fact that our grants office has 1 or 2 people. So when you have multiple requirements for grant writing, that makes it very difficult for our people to write grants. And so that was one of the good thing about the Green Climate Fund, because all the money is going to one part of money fund, and we know what the requirements are, and it's easier to follow. So I'm not just saying that that's the only way that we would go or we would support. I think the notion of bilateral funds is also a good way to invest in supporting islands, because at the end of the day, it's a negotiation between the country, the island nation, and the country that the donor nation. And so it makes it easy to determine requirements and needs of the country that is asking. So I would, I continue to support the Green Climate Fund only because it's a big pot of money that can, that would have just one set of requirements for us, rather than have multiple funds out there that we have to write grants to. It makes it a little bit more difficult for small countries. So I would stop there.
Okay, so thanks very much, Hilda. That's a really good point. I'll pass to Catherine, who maybe wants to choose the next question.
I'll send through another question from the audience. Climate change is a serious threat that can no longer be ignored. And now more than ever, it's becoming increasingly clear that immediate action is not being taken. How can we hold world leaders accountable for failures to act? And I'll address that to both of you if you'd like to comment.
Oh boy. How do you hold leaders accountable? You know, I think this is one of the $1 million question going into COP 26, because we know that OECD countries, G20, they have to come up with financing and the commitments that they made in the Paris Agreement. How do we make them accountable? That's, you know, I don't know how to answer that. You know, I have been talking and doing international advocacy based on our moral voice, I guess, trying to say, here we are all in this, we live in this one planet. We share the planet. We have to be good to each other. We have to take ownership and responsibility for actions that we've taken over the years. How do you communicate that to countries who put profit over livelihood of people? I think this is a conversation that needs to happen at COP26. And I think we need to move beyond just doing the same thing. We have to build trust. Right now, there is an issue of trust between developing countries and the developed countries. And that came from the COVID pandemic, because while, you know, rich countries are having all the vaccine they need, some countries are not having anything. And so that creates an issue of trust for us. And so when it comes to climate change, we have to look at that too. Who is being affected by the climate change impacts? Mostly people in the South, people who are vulnerable and are not rich. How do we bridge this gap and make rich countries accountable to these to smaller and poorer countries? You know, and it's a very difficult question. It would be good to see how the COP26 will handle that.
Thank you. And Kathy, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, through the UNFCCC process, you can see who has not submitted an NDC or whose national determined contribution is, their ambition is really low. There's a reporting that happens every 5 years, and ways in which, you know, anybody can access those documents. Anybody can read those and see, you know, which countries are not doing their part. And I think that's really up to the citizens of those countries to be holding their leaders accountable at the end of the day. But we have to all work together to make this happen, because, you know, as I said before, we've turned our attention internally to protecting ourselves, but, you know, it's going to just continue to get worse if people don't take it seriously. And we were experiencing the brunt of it very, very early on. And I think we're finally seeing it in kind of the first world nations around the world. They're experiencing it themselves. And so it's just about coming to terms with that and, you know, coming together. And I think I really believe a lot in activism and citizen power to hold people accountable. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Great. And before I ask the next question, just wanted to check with the two of you, time sort of marching on. I wondered whether, since we have a few more good questions, would either or both of you have time to stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes beyond the end of the hour, or not?
I can.
This is for the debriefing?
Oh, no, I got you the other questions.
To keep the question session going, just a few minutes longer.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Well,
thank you.
But, yeah.
All right. That's great. Thanks a lot. Okay, so next question I've got here. What NGOs and intergovernmental groups exist that are collaborating on climate narratives, actions and policies across the Pacific? What more can be done to include more frontline voices from the US affiliated territories and the freely associated states in Micronesia? Quite a long question, but really what NGOs and intergovernmental groups exist that are collaborating on the narratives, actions and policies across the Pacific, I think is the key part of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned one earlier, 350 Pacific Climate Warriors, our nonprofit, the only one that focuses on youth and climate change particularly. One of the directors from DIVA is on here. It's a women's rights and yeah, Nolene is on here. And so that's a group based out of Fiji that does really important intersectional work. I've also, Mom, do you know of any other ones? I'm trying to remember.
Well, I mean, we have the women's group that are, with membership from across the region that come together to discuss issues, including climate change. So that's one group, the Pacific Triennial, that convenes all the Pacific women. In Micronesia, we have our own caucus where women from Micronesia come together periodically to look at issues we are faced with, and climate change has been one of the areas that we looked at.
Yeah, Yolanda Lodge is the leader of, is a director for an organization out in Micronesia. So if you're looking for somewhere outside of the Marshall Islands, Big Resources for Education and Learning is a nonprofit both Mom worked with for many years.
That's right.
Yeah, so they've developed curriculum on climate change. I'm trying to think of other ones.
Yeah, there is also in the Micronesia region, the Pacific Post-Secondary Education Council, which is all the community colleges in the area. That's a group that also look at this at the post-secondary level.
Yeah. Here, there's the Marshall Islands Conservation Society. That's a really big one too. They look at, they're definitely more marine science focused based. And then, I'm trying to think of course, there's SPC, SPREP.
SPC, PrEP.
Yeah, SPREP is the one that is leading the climate organizing through the Pacific at COP. So SPREP is probably the biggest organization to do that.
Great, thanks. This next question, I think we'll start with Kathy, and then Hilda, if you have anything to add, please feel welcome. The voice of Pacifica youth is so powerful here, but it takes financial support to mobilize that voice. So how can we get more financial support to carry that voice of Pacifica youth? And if the financial support doesn't flow, how else can we do that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I totally feel that. I think our nonprofit is struggling with funds too. Most of the nonprofits out here are struggling to just kind of get by and get the funds that we need, and we're struggling with low capacity and limited capacity too. So I think leaders need to recognize the value of youth. It's kind of very difficult for the Pacific because we're very much taught that youth have to stay quiet, that we have to be subservient, and we have to let the elders lead, and it's disrespectful. And so a lot of times there's kind of some thinking that there's not as much value in investing in youth. But I think from the work that Mom's done with education and through the Youth Corps, and then through my own experiences and in witnessing the Fridays for Our Future, it's so valuable and so important. So I really think it's on policymakers and leaders to be designating those funds and taking a bit of a leap of faith. I think working with youth isn't just throwing money at them also, but it's also providing a holistic sort of support for them, that really takes into consideration their growth rather than just using them as mouthpieces, right? But at the end of the day, I agree there really needs to be a lot more that has to be designated.
Yeah, just to add to that, to what Kathy says, of course, youth groups like 350 Pacific, they need funding to do more of what they're doing and to be more established in different places in the Pacific. On the side of the governments, each government has youth divisions with youth policy, but no money to carry out or implement their policies. And so this is an area that that could be assisted, so that that youth can be more involved in doing a lot of this work in the climate space.
Thank you.
Okay, just looking through the remaining questions. An interesting one here, and maybe addressed to you first, Kathy. But apart from the environmental influence of your mum's advocacy, if there is no financial support for advocacy available for Pacifica youth, what could
James,
be done?
I think I sort of covered that question. If you'd like to try another one, sorry.
Sorry. No, of course. Oh, yeah, I'm getting lost in the questions here. Pardon me. What more? Yeah, sorry. Yes. What more can New Zealand and Australia do to support female UNFCCC negotiators from the Pacific to ensure their voices are heard and represented?
That's a good question. I'll try to put some thoughts in there, but training women negotiators, or having training for women negotiators from the different island groups, that would be one way to help build confidence, getting women to know what it is and how they can be more assertive when they go to these climate change conferences. I know that in the Marshall Islands we have some really good women negotiators, or women who've been involved in the negotiating space, or at least sitting in the back and listening in. Maybe they could do more if they're given more focused training in this area. So I thought I'd just say that, but I'm sure there are other ways that can be assisted.
Yeah, speaking as somebody who's like trying to learn about negotiations now, and it's really, really difficult. I think that there are female negotiators that are there that I'm learning from, and I'm really fortunate to be learning from them. So I think it's really about listening to the current female negotiators, giving them the support that they need, and then giving them the space to be able to pass on what the knowledge that they have to other young women, and to other women just in general, to be able to join those spaces. So I think there are quite a few women from SIDS and from AOSIS who are negotiating and who are taking that on, and I think that's probably really valuable. And then the Women's Environmental Development Organization actually provided some negotiations training also to some of our members before they headed to COP. That's another organization that does provide training. So it is out there. I think it's just about finding it and then providing that kind of support.
And I'll direct the next question. I'll put it to you, Hilda, in the first instance, and it's around mobilizing the funding that's needed for adaptation and the challenge around that. And any thoughts on how we can mobilize that type of funding, and whether you feel it's more effective to frame that in terms of support for adaptation or reparation for damages, or both?
Well, yeah, I think there is definitely a need for both. Right now, as we speak, there are damages going, or happening in different parts of the small island countries that could be, that could use some reparation funds. So we need to look at that as well as we move forward. But at the same time, as we continue to develop our adaptation plan, we would need the support to actually make those plans real. So I would look at both and try to mobilize support for both. I know that some of our friends, especially in Tuvalu and other places, have been going very serious about the loss and damage issue as part of the climate change discussion, and we haven't been making too much headway in that area. And so I think we need to take a look at that, because it is happening. As I said before, our small budget, our monies are redirected from our existing budget to deal with climate impacts as they happen in our communities, and because there is no other funds to help with those repairs and to help mitigate those damages currently.
Thank you. Kathy, anything further from you on that? Sorry, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, Article 6 market mechanism is debating how much of the funds should be allocated towards adaptation. And I think that what we're like, because there's emission trade-offs in that market mechanism, and some of those profits are getting allocated to certain areas, and we think, that it should be at least 5% of it should be given to just adaptation. But I also think, just like Mom said, loss and damage is going to be a really important area that we're currently trying to explore. And there's still a lot to be learned, that I have to learn about it, to be honest, before I can really speak to it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. It's a little after 1 o'clock now. I think we still have 1 o'clock in New Zealand, at least. We have a number of questions still coming in, but maybe we should wrap things up. So yes, thanks to both of you for your really fascinating in-depth answers and your commentary on what's happening and the work that you've done. It's been really inspiring to me. So I think we'll call it to a close there. I'll hand back to Charlie to finish wrapping things up. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you so much to Hilda and Kathy for taking the time to join us today. It's been, like I said at the beginning, it's been a huge privilege to hear from you and learn more about your experiences. So thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to James and Catherine as well for leading this session. And we hope all of you that have joined today enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again for all the great questions you've sent through. Sorry if we didn't get a chance to cover yours off, but I'm just going to hand over to Phil now to close the session for us with a karakia.
Thank you very much, Kathy and Hilda. I really enjoyed that. At the Commission, we get very focused on what we can do here in New Zealand, and it's great to step back and see some of those broader reasons about why we're doing this. So appreciate that. As a closing karakia, e te atua manakitia mai mātou, e hoki nei, kia ora mātou kāinga, amine. Bless us all as we return to our homes. Ka kite.